All right, so now that you've talked through what the code will look like with a gamepad, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go in and we're going to add input into a game using the gamepad knowledge that we have. So what I need you to do is open up Visual Studio, and here we're going to start a new project, and we're going to call this Unit 4 input types, because we're going to do various types of input types in this with the gamepad and the keyboard. So Unit 4 input types, press OK. And then from here, you should be able to click on game1.cs and you should be able to see your basic outline of your game. So here, just like normal, I'm going to scoop up the comments so that I can read where my methods are a little bit easier. And what I need to do first is I need to think about what my program is going to do. Well, I want this program to change the background of the screen depending on what values I'm pressing on my gamepad. So, for example, in here, I'm going to actually have to put in the red, green, and blue values so that they can change. So I have a byte value called red that I'm starting at 0, a byte value called green that I'm also starting at 0, and a byte value .blue that I'm starting at 0 as well. And I'm creating these colors. This ties in with what we did in Unit 3. These are going to hold the red, green, and blue intensity values for the background color of the screen. So we're going to create these values, and then we're going to use our gamepad to change red, change green, change blue as the program is going on. So if we're pressing the red button, the red will change. If we're pressing the green button, the blue will change. So now if you go down to draw, we actually need to make sure we have a color object using these colors. So I'm going to create a color object called background equal to new color object using the red, green, and blue byte variables from up above. And then I want to make sure that I clear this to the background of my screen. So I'm going to change that graphics device.clear to be my color object called background. So now what should happen if I press start is it should clear to black, having a red, green, and blue value of 0 that aren't changing, and it does. It clears exactly to black. So now from here, I want to add in input so that I can actually use the gamepad throughout my game. So if you remember in the videos that you just watched, I talk about how we need to do the gamepad and declare and initialize it in update, because ultimately we want those gamepad settings resetting every 60th of a second so that they're accurate with what the user is actually doing. So remember, we create a gamepad state object, and you can call this whatever you'd like. I name them by pad, so this is for pad 1. Now the purpose of creating this object is to create an object to hold the state of all of the buttons, all of the joysticks, all of the D-pads, all of the everything, the triggers, everything on that gamepad. This gamepad state object is going to hold whether those buttons are pressed or released, what direction the joystick is leaning towards, etc. So in order to save all the state of those buttons in there, I need to set this pad 1 equal to gamepad.get state with player index dot 1. So what this line of code right here is stating is go to the gamepad class, use the get state method, which will get the state of all of the buttons on a gamepad. And this player index.1 is saying, look at the player, or look at player 1. Look at the person who is plugged into player 1's outlet. So here is where you're going to get the state of player 1's gamepad, and then you're going to save those settings inside of your pad 1 object. So now what's happened is every 60th of a second, pad 1 accurately holds the button settings, the joystick settings, the D-pad, the trigger, the everything settings of that gamepad. So now what happens is because pad 1 has been updated, we can use this. And this is where our knowledge of conditionals comes in, because if something is happening with pad 1, then we want to use that. And if button A or button B or button X, whatever it is being pressed, we want our game to respond accordingly. So I'm going to say if, and then in here I'm going to put, okay, if the B button is being pressed, because if you look at your gamepad, you can see that the B button is red. So if we're going to do pad 1 dot buttons dot B. So this is saying look at pad 1, look at the buttons, and look at the B button. And what we want you to do is check if its button state is pressed. So the button can be pressed or released. And if that button is pressed, we want something to happen. So remember, this line of code right here is saying, look at pad 1's B button. That is how we access the B button state. And if it's equal to button state.press, that says the button is pressed down. So if that button is pressed down, we want red to increment. That's what we want to happen. So now, if you've plugged this in, and if you've plugged your game controller into the side of the computer, when you press start, what will happen is your game will start off as black. But if you press the B button, like I'm just about to do right now, you'll notice the red is increasing. And I can press it more, the red is increasing. And it stops when I stop pressing because I can respond appropriately. And then when I hit that 256 mark, it'll flip back to 0. But you'll notice I can increase my red. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to do two things. So first, we've now added in the code, so I can add this in and saying increase red intensity when B button, red button is pressed. And we know here that we are saving the settings of the game pad for player 1. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to add in a couple things. I'd like you to add in code to increase the blue intensity when the X button, which is blue, is pressed. I'd like you to increase green intensity when the A button, which is green, is pressed. And I'd like you to increase the yellow intensity, which is green and red together. Believe it or not, in light, it's green and red that makes yellow, when the Y button is pressed. So I'd like you to add in the code to make those three things happen. Make those other buttons respond and change in accordance to their color. So that's your task. When you're done, you can then move on to the next task.